So as Edward said, it is time for our next session. Next up is Mark Richards. Mark is a, sorry, something had happened with my screen again. Excuse me. Mark has explored Carroll's life and work since the 1970s with a particular focus on mathematics and nonsense. Mark is a former chair of Lewis Carroll Society in the UK and also a former editor of the Carrollian. He's currently developing lewiscarrollresources.net, and I believe there was a link to that in the chat yesterday and today as well, as a collection of resources to support Carroll scholarship. Today, Mark is going to talk to us about reflection, recursion, and self-reference, mathematics, surrealism, and the mind of Lewis Carroll. And I believe that topic explains the fractal vegetable in the background.
Thank you very much. If I could just check that I've got my screen share working. Does that sound come through? No, maybe not. Yeah, no, the sound's okay, good.
Yes.
So thank you very much, Hugh. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Paddy Johnson for all her help with getting this meeting going. It's been, it's gone really well. Thank you. And of course, I want to thank Linda. Linda, thank you very much for all the work you do as president of the North American Society. I have a message for you that comes from Ray Bradbury.
Linda, you're absolutely fantastic.
So I'm going to be relying rather heavily on my slideshow for this talk today. And so you may find it easier if you have the screen share and my windows side by side. There's many ways in Zoom that you can set it up. But if you have the screen and my window side by side, there should be a little button that says view at the top right hand corner of your screen. And if you click on that, it says side by side. And then you can change the size of the screen and the size of my window. It's up to you how you do it. I mean, you may want to just turn the whole thing off. I don't know. Anyway, oh yes, now I need to just say that some of my images are technically still in copyright. And I'm permitted to use these images today on the basis that this is an educational talk. And I've consulted my international copyright lawyers on this, and they tell me that for this to be deemed an educational talk, it requires three things. First, you must have a coffee in one of these sort of things next to you on the desk. Secondly, you must have your phone with Facebook on it so you can chat to your friends during it. And thirdly, you're not allowed to enjoy it. So if at any point you get any pleasure from what I'm saying, you must leave immediately. Otherwise, I'm just going to end up in court. So now where are we? Just get on with it now, will you please? Oh yeah, okay then. So this presentation is not going to be a structured study of these concepts, but reflection, recursion, and self-reference will be constant themes throughout what I'm saying. If we want to measure the universe, applied mathematics will give us good tools for the job. But I believe that if you want to understand it, it's actually to pure mathematics that we should turn. We may observe and analyze our world as being composed of physical things, substances, atoms, particles, things we can see and measure. Alternatively, we could see the world as a collection of concepts that have no physical nature, beauty, pain, achievement, commitment, etc. But we can also see it as things that are more often associated with mathematics, such as reflection, recursion, and self-reference. So what I'm really going to be talking about is mathematics, surrealism, and the mind of Lewis Carroll, and how the three interconnect. And I'm going to start by talking nonsense. No, sorry, I'm going to start by discussing nonsense. When we come across something which appears to be nonsensical, an idea, word, phrase, or an image, a painting perhaps, what's our reaction to it? Do we ignore it, reject it, on the basis that it is just nonsense? Do we try to embrace it? That is to say, try to appreciate it because it is nonsense, perhaps open ourselves to the humor of it, or just enjoy the absurdity of something? Or do we try to rationalize it? And by that I mean, accept that it makes no nonsense in the real world as we perceive it, but try to imagine or create the circumstances in which it does have some sense. For many, it would be all too easy just to walk past a painting like this one by surrealist superstar Dorothea Tanning simply because it just looks so bizarre. But in this case, close inspection will reveal this fascinating reference to Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, which is put into a deeper context by this thought-provoking quote by the artist. There's no right or wrong way to regard things that are apparently nonsensical, and no reason why you shouldn't just walk past a painting like this if you don't like it. But I plan to demonstrate that in mathematics, surrealism, and the world of Lewis Carroll, we can find instances where by rationalizing what has been observed, rather than ignoring it, the sublime has emerged out of the ridiculous. So let us begin with a simple, almost trivial example, The Hunting of the Snark. The Snark was published in 1876, 4 and a bit years after Through the Looking Glass. This 140-verse poem is best described as a mock heroic epic, not quite parodying Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but surely written with that in mind. Carroll describes how he was out walking one day in 1874 near Guildford in the south of England, and a now famous single sentence came into his head: "For the Snark was a boojum, you see." He claimed not to know its meaning at the time and not to have learnt its meaning subsequently, but he managed to use it as the last line of the poem, which, as we know, became his most successful work after the Alice books. The important point here is that rather than just ignore the strange words that came into his head, as many of us would have done, Carroll chose to use them in a poem, even though he had no sense of their meaning or whether other people would be amused by them. It's believed that when Carroll imagined those strange words, "the Snark was a boojum," he was in a rather vexed state of mind. One of his godchildren being worryingly ill at that time. Although apparent nonsense may reveal itself to us under any circumstances, there are situations where it seems more prevalent, and perhaps the obvious place to start to explore this question lies around our sleep, immediately before, during, or just after. In that brief moment, as we start to fall asleep, sometimes we see things, illusions, which are not exactly dreams because we're not quite fully asleep at that point, but we would not say that whatever it is we are observing exists in reality. There is a term for this, as Salvador Dali will tell us.
Is hypnagogical image.
What did he say?
Is hypnagogical image.
These hypnagogical images may take the form of living beings, inanimate objects, shapes, or even inanimate objects which become animated. Here is Dali's painting Hypnagogic Landscape from 1934. It shows a barren landscape, rather typical of Dali's work of that period, and incorporates an inexplicable object. This is a real landscape, while the object, a mathematical self-connecting shape, a three-dimensional yin-yang symbol, if you like, is an illusion. The word hypnopompic is used for the equivalent phenomena used during waking moments. I can only ever recall having hypnopompic illusions myself, but I suspect many of you have had one sort or the other. And looking out there right now, it looks like one or two of you might be experiencing something like this right now. These experiences become interesting and relevant to our subject when we start to wonder where these illusions come from and see where they take us. If we lived in more imaginative times and our outlook was perhaps more inspired by Blake than Newton, we might regard these as spirits, ghosts, fairies, or even glimpses into another dimension, or objects from the past or the future. It could be something that really does exist, we just cannot see it unless we're in a certain state of mind. Science, of course, is full of such things which do not register on our senses, which only reveal themselves under certain circumstances and to certain people. Dog whistles, for example, which some humans can hear, but most cannot, or magnetism, which we are convinced exists, but we generally cannot see it or sense it. On reading about the concept of hypnagogic phenomena in a journal called World Medicine in 1974, the British medic, Carroll scholar, and now doyen of the Lewis Carroll Societies, Selwyn Goodacre, identified a possible connection between such phenomena and one of Carroll's lesser read works. I quote Dr. Goodacre: 2 years after the publication of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, at the age of 35, he wrote a rather sentimental fairy story called Bruno's Revenge. In the early part of this, he wrote, "What is the best time for seeing fairies? I believe I can tell you that. The first rule is that it must be a very hot day. That we may consider as settled. And you must be just a little sleepy, but not too sleepy to keep your eyes open, mind. Well, and you ought to feel a little what one might call fairyish. The Scotch call it eerie, and perhaps that's a prettier word. If you don't know what it means, I'm afraid I can hardly explain it. You must wait until you meet a fairy, and then you'll know." Darley had a less poetic approach. He would rest his chin on a spoon and would hold it as he fell asleep. And just at the point of nodding off, he would drop the spoon and wake up. And suddenly, he claimed, paint the image that he had just been witnessing. André Breton, who was in effect the founder of the first Surrealist group, had other methods. In the first Manifesto of Surrealism, published in 1924, Breton describes an occasion when a random phrase and accompanying image came into his mind. "One evening, before I fell asleep, I perceived a strange phrase which came to me without any apparent relationship to the events in which I was then involved. There is a man cut in two by the window." There could be no question of ambiguity, accompanied as it was by the faint visual image of a man walking, cut halfway up by a window perpendicular to the axis of his body. I realized that I was dealing with an image of a fairly rare sort, and all I could think of was to incorporate it into my material for poetic construction. Breton later described how one could get into the right state of mind to allow such things to manifest themselves when writing. Put yourself in as passive or perceptive state of mind as you can. Forget about your genius, your talents, and the talents of everyone else. Write quickly, without any preconceived subject, fast enough so you'll not remember what you're writing, and then be tempted to reread what you have written. This bears a strong similarity to Lewis Carroll's rules for observing fairies. For the Surrealists, this is often referred to as automatic writing. It has similarities with the concept of stream of consciousness writing, and some might even regard it as a form of divine inspiration. This also brings to mind the circumstances under which the original story of Alice was conceived. It's well known that the story grew out of a series of tales told to children, specifically the daughters of the Dean of Christ Church at Oxford, which led to the famous Alice manuscript. The origin of the story, as an unplanned spoken entertainment, gives the book its spontaneity. Being told to the children in that extempore way, the books were the result of Carroll putting himself in the passive or perceptive state of mind that Breton describes, allowing the children, in particular Alice, to direct the storytelling. It seems almost inevitable that if one detaches oneself from reality for a moment, then any manifestations that appear are likely to seem unreal or nonsensical. It's what one does about it that is of interest. Such opportunities do not only come to us when we are in a hypnagogic state or trying to tap into our own unconscious minds. Sometimes they appear in plain sight, particularly in mathematics. Mathematicians and surrealists alike often have no objective in mind when they pursue an idea. Something points them in a certain direction and they pursue it until they get, well, somewhere. If you've ever thought about a concept like the square root of -1, you'd be forgiven for thinking it simply didn't exist and therefore was not worthy of much attention. You could ignore it as being nonsensical. Alternatively, you could try to analyze it, rationalize it, find a meaning for it. And as you may know, the study of the square root of -1 leads to a branch of mathematics generally called complex numbers, which actually has useful applications in the real world, in spite of being built on an entirely imaginary concept. Similarly, one might not think that there are scenarios in which the shortest distance between 2 points is anything but a straight line, but trying to conceive of circumstances where this might not be the case opens up the way to alternative geometries, which have real applications in map making, GPS calculations, space travel, etc. There's no evidence to show that Lewis Carroll ever studied complex numbers or these alternative geometries, but he did explore the concept of a fourth coordinate in algebraical geometry, writing papers on it in 1859 and referring to it as a fourth dimension. But more importantly, Carroll had that same fascination for playful discovery that led to many of the 20th century's developments in mathematics. And a particular example of this in the area of reflections and self-reference. Self-reference, is that like talking to yourself? Well, not really, but let's look at reflections first. One of the earliest known forms of self-reference is Narcissus, that attractive hunter from Greek mythology. Narcissus declined all romantic approaches, but eventually fell in love with his own image when he saw it reflected in water. The use of reflections and mirrors has permeated art and literature throughout history and has been the inspiration for some of our most loved works, from the so-called Rokeby Venus by Velasquez to Bowie's self-reflective lyrics, I turned myself to face me in Changes, and not least of all, a certain children's book published 150 years ago. Reflections and reversals appear throughout Through the Looking Glass, but they are common in other areas of Carroll's work. Sylvian Bruno, for example, is constructed around numerous reflections, reversals, and parallel worlds. And I hope someone will pick up on that and submit a proposal to the Looking Glass conference being organized by Dr. Colt at York University later this year. Carroll's biliteral diagram for the game of logic has a reflexive symmetry. X at the top, not X at the bottom, Y on the left, not Y on the right. The beauty and efficacy of Carroll's diagrams lie in that symmetry, a symmetry which does not exist in the diagrams used for similar purposes by mathematicians John Venn or Leonhard Euler. Self-reference within mathematics and logic has a special significance. To lead us into this, let's look at an example, a literary one, and why not? Take these two words, autological and heterological. You may know them or may have come across slightly different words for the same concepts. We say a word is autological if it describes itself and heterological if it doesn't. So the word English is an English word, so we'd say it describes itself and therefore it's autological. French is not a French word, so it's heterological. Short, well, that is short, so it's autological, and monosyllabic is certainly not monosyllabic, it's polysyllabic, so that's heterological. And then my favorite of these, 17 lettered. So I'll leave you to work that one out, but while you do that, let's consider the word heterological. Does it refer to itself or not? If it's autological, it refers to itself and therefore it must be heterological, in which case it can't be autological. On the other hand, if it is heterological, it does not describe itself, in which case it is not heterological. So whichever way you look at this one, you get a contradiction, and it's all rather perplexing. The problem here, of course, comes from the presence of self-reference. Because these words refer to themselves, the whole thing becomes rather complex. Situations like this are referred to as dialetheia, and they have the same fundamental form as the familiar liar paradox. I say familiar because you probably remember it from this.
Everything Harry tells you is a lie.
Listen to this carefully, Norman.
Oh, sorry.
You say you are lying, but if everything you say is a lie, then you are telling the truth. But you cannot tell the truth because everything you say is a lie. But you lie, you tell the truth, but you cannot, for you lie. Illogical, illogical.
Carroll composed a number of logic puzzles based around the veracity of a set of given statements, referring to them as lying problems. Here's a relatively simple one from a letter written to John Cook Wilson, professor of logic at Oxford, with whom Carroll had many long-running arguments. Wilson believed all such lying problems were impossible and unmeaning. Carroll disagreed and actually made some progress with analysing their structure. However, their complexity meant they did not easily fit into the work that he was doing when he started to publish his planned 3-volume treatise on symbolic logic. At one point, he perceived the subject as so complex and requiring further work that he chose simply to avoid such puzzles in his teaching logic at that time. In the preface to the 4th edition of his symbolic logic, he writes, I have given I have given a new version of the problem of the 5 liars. My object in doing so is to escape the subtle and mysterious difficulties which beset all attempts at regarding a proposition as being its own subject, or a set of propositions as being subjects for one another. It is certainly a most bewildering and unsatisfactory theory. I cannot help but feeling that there is a great lack of substance in all this shadowy host, that as the procession of phantoms glides before us, there is not one that we can pounce upon and say, here is a proposition that must be either true or false, and that its prototype is to be found in that mythical island whose inhabitants earned a precarious living by taking in each other's washing. Carroll's work on symbolic logic started out in a very simple way. He was looking for new methods of teaching a subject. But as his work progressed, it became increasingly more substantial, and at the point at which he passed away, he was tackling issues that were challenging the greatest logicians of all time. And in a small way, he preempted some of the ideas that evolved in the early 20th century. Had he lived longer, I feel sure he would have developed his own theory around these liar paradoxes. Their significance should not be understated. They play an important part in the foundations of mathematics. Some of you will know that they are, in effect, the basis of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which have had a huge impact on the development of mathematics in the 20th century. Wherever it appears, self-reference leads us to interesting places, sometimes nonsensical, sometimes entertaining, sometimes tragic, but always interesting. When something is faced with its opposite, they can both disappear. Positive meets negative. A person meets their doppelganger, as depicted in this work by Rossetti. Augustus Egg's Travelling Companions has a beautiful mirror symmetry and raises wonderful questions. Are these two sisters? Are they two personalities of the same woman? Is one dreaming of the other, etc.? Egg died within a couple of years of completing this painting. Had he caught a glimpse of his own doppelganger? Tenniel's supposed parody of the painting in Through the Looking Glass raises many more questions, which I will leave others to explore. Self-reference does not always lead to self-cancellation. It can also lead to recursion or infinite regress. Lewis Carroll's A Tangled Tale was a series of 10 linked short stories published in a journal called The Monthly Packet and reissued as a single volume in 1885. Each story contained one or more puzzles or conundrums of ranging difficulty and covering a variety of subjects. In the penultimate chapter, the following piece was included, with the invitation that readers would send in their analyses or explanations of what is actually happening. Suppose a solid is held above the surface of a liquid and partially immersed. A portion of the liquid is displaced and the level of the liquid rises. But by this rise of level, a little more of the solid is of course immersed, and so there is a new displacement of a second portion of the liquid and a consequent rise of level. Again, this second rise of level causes yet a further immersion and by consequence another displacement of liquid and another rise. It is self-evident that this process must continue till the entire solid is immersed, and that the liquid will then begin to immerse whatever holds the solid, which, being connected with it, must for the time being be considered part of it. If you hold a stick 6 feet long with its end in a tumbler of water and wait long enough, you must eventually be immersed. The question as to the source from which the water is supplied, which belongs to a high branch of mathematics and is therefore beyond our present scope, does not apply to the sea. Let us therefore take the familiar instance of a man standing at the edge of the sea at ebb tide with a solid in his hand, which he partially immerses. He remains steadfast and unmoved, and we all know that he must be drowned. The multitudes who daily perish in this manner to attest the philosophical truth, and whose bodies the unreasoning waves cast sullenly upon our thankless shores, have a truer claim to be called the martyrs of science than a Galileo or a Kepler. Comedian Rich Hall draws on the same concept in one of his routines.
I saw this great article in the Times once. They were trying to describe how much $88 billion is worth, for whatever his current worth was at the time, Bill Gates. And this is the best they could come up with. This is what it said. That Bill Gates took all his money and stuffed it under his mattress, as you would. fell out of bed, it would take him 18 minutes to hit the floor. Feel, fella? Who had to work that equation out? That's sad. Graphics illustrator / mathematician got roped into that one. Stuffed his money on his mattress. Stuffed $88 billion of it. Just work it out. Size mattress is he sleeping on? That makes a difference. Wearing the glasses when he falls, because factor there could slow him down. The interest on $88 billion. Do I take that into account? He just took the interest on $88 billion and shoveled that under the mattress as he was falling. Technically, Bill Gates would never hit the floor, ladies and gentlemen.
Of course, many such questions are resolved courtesy of the fact that in each case we have an infinite series of numbers which, when totaled together, give a finite sum. A half plus a quarter plus an eighth, etc. We all know that, in spite of that being an infinite series and therefore impossible to actually sum up in a finite time, the total is actually 1. This type of paradox has been traced back to the Greek philosopher Zeno. Time does not allow me to explore Zeno's work in detail, but one of his paradoxes will surely already be familiar to you. Put simply, and without getting into a discussion about whether technically this is a paradox, when Achilles and the tortoise decide to have a race, Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. By the time Achilles has got to the position where the tortoise was at the start, the tortoise will have moved on to another place. And by the time Achilles has got to that point, the tortoise will have moved on again. Thus, Achilles will never catch the tortoise. Dodson wrote a short paper on the paradox in 1874, although he didn't have it published. He did, however, return to the subject of for the proposed but unpublished second volume of Symbolic Logic. Here he presents Zeno's paradox as a problem to be solved and provides his own solution, describing it as a mathematical fallacy, stating that it relies on the false assumption that a series of distances, infinite as to number, is also infinite as to length. Carroll gave a nod to Zeno's problems of infinite series in his essay, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, published in the journal Mind in 1895. The idea behind this hugely significant work, which is actually unrelated to Zeno's paradoxes, came as a result or byproduct of his work on teaching symbolic logic. Let me attempt to explain it. The story here is that Achilles is attempting to explain to the tortoise how a simple fact can be deduced from two statements. The first statement is that things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. Now, if the meaning of that is not immediately obvious to you, don't worry, we'll look at it in a moment. The second statement is that the two sides of this triangle are equal to the same. Now, the conclusion, which Achilles and most of us will come to, is that the two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. Z follows logically from A and B. In case this is a bit obscure, let's delve into it further. Things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. So if P equals S and Q equals S, regardless of what we mean by P, Q, and S, then we would say P is equal to Q. For example, if you told me your age is 48 and my age is 48, well, it could be, then we would say we have the same age. If this side of the triangle is P and this side of the triangle is Q and both P and Q equal 5, then we would say P is equal to Q. So things that are equal to the same are equal to each other. The two sides of this triangle are equal to the same. Therefore, the two sides of this triangle are equal to each other. Now, the tortoise says, I accept A and I accept B, but I don't accept that Z follows from A and B. In order to accept that, I need one other statement. And that is, if A and B are true, then Z is true. And we'll call this C for simplicity. So now we have three statements, A, B, and C, and now we should be able to prove Z, except the tortoise says, no, I accept A, I accept B, and I accept C. But what I now need is another statement that says, if A, B, and C are true, then Z is true. And this is a statement D. So you can see this tortoise, he's never going to accept it because he gets into this infinite regress. Many people regard this piece as the most significant of all non-literary works by Carroll. In November 2016, the Lewis Carroll Society in the UK published a special issue of the Carrollian, entirely on what the tortoise said to Achilles. It is 136 pages and features a collection of articles written by leading experts in philosophy and logic from around the world, and I recommend it. It's available to buy through the Lewis Carroll Society. But if you're a student in full-time education and you're watching this now live, and you think this may be relevant to your field of study, get in touch and I will acquire a copy for you and have it sent to you. When we start a process that has repeated reference or recursion, the result can be finite, infinite, or even fluctuating. And whilst this might be regarded as a purely mathematical concept, there are many parallels in real life. One might ask, why is it that some people are able to maintain an almost constant weight without effort, whilst others find themselves locked in a pattern of behavior which sees their weight increase or decrease in an inescapable vicious circle? We often see the devastating effect of self-reference in other areas. Alcoholics sometimes find themselves imbibing simply to counter the negative effects of their own drinking habits. Inbreeding is a form of self-reference with significant outcomes. Believing what people say about you, being your own critic, letting the students set the curriculum, all examples of self-reference with noticeable effects. And let's not forget Narcissus, of course, was a tragic case. But it's not all bad and it's not all serious. Self-reference can take many forms. Carroll, for example, made a number of back references to his own works. The Hare and the Hatter from Wonderland reappear in Looking Glass. The Bandersnatch and the Jub Jub Bird from Looking Glass reappear in The Hunting of the Snark. There's a reference to the Mock Turtle in one of the later logic papers. And in A Tangled Tale, he refers to one of his yet to be published poems as an old song. But there are many other interesting examples of self-reference to be found throughout Carroll's works. In a letter to his sister Louisa, dated September 1897, he asks, "Please analyze logically the following piece of reasoning. Little girl, I'm so glad I don't like asparagus. Friend, why, my dear? Little girl, because if I did like it, I should have to eat it, and I can't bear it. It bothers me considerably, your loving brother, C.L. Dodson." In Sylvie and Bruno, we met the crocodile that walked up its own back. "Who never saw a crocodile so proud," said Bruno. "Why, it could go round and walk on top of its own tail, and all along its back, and all the way to its head. Once it walked on tippity-toe so as it wouldn't wake itself, because it thought it were asleep. And it got its paws on its tail, and it walked all the way along its back, and it walked on its forehead, and it walked a tiny little way down its nose." Well, what I hope these examples demonstrate is that there are themes running through Carroll's work, such as reflection, recursion, and self-reference. And of course, I could have included other things such as chiasmus, so expertly explained to us by Professor Copley yesterday. These concepts are the fundamental building blocks of our lives and the way our universe functions. If a writer or artist opens up their mind to such things, the sublime sometimes emerges from the ridiculous. And by refusing to reject nonsense, we can set ourselves on a path that leads us to great things and a greater understanding of ourselves. It's worth dwelling on the idea that embarking on telling the story of Alice's adventures, it was not Carroll's intention to write a book which would be published. He certainly expressed no ambition to write a bestseller. He simply put himself in a state of mind that would open the way to the unknown. Later, when describing the genesis of Alice, he stated that the ideas grew of themselves. With particular reference to how the underground manuscript was expanded to become Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Carroll states that every idea and nearly every word of dialogue came of itself. In an article in the Theatre magazine, he writes, "Sometimes an idea comes at night when I've had to get up and strike a light to note it down, sometimes when out on a lonely winter walk." It was afterwards that these ideas, apparently random ideas, were fine-tuned to create the literary masterpieces. When put like that, this does not sound radically different from the typical creative process of many successful writers or artists. But let's look into that a moment. In a 1962 interview, Henry Miller had some interesting comments on this matter. Miller, incidentally, described himself as a surrealist and has spoken of his aspirations to write at a level equal to Carroll's. The waking mind, you see, is the least serviceable in the arts. In the process of writing, one is struggling to bring out what is unknown to himself. To put down merely what one is conscious of means nothing really, gets one nowhere. Back in 1936, around the time the Surrealists were first emerging, in a letter to Lawrence Durrell, Miller wrote, "What constitutes Surrealism is a permanent thing in art, more especially in literature. Swift was a good one, so was Lewis Carroll, and in my opinion, and Shakespeare too now and again." Further on in the same letter, he writes, "It's only an effort at bottom to return to the original vital source. It's the solar plexus, the unconscious, or the stars, if you like." In the 1962 interview, Miller further stated, "The Surrealists employed this technique far too deliberately. It became unintelligible. It served no purpose. Once one loses all intelligibility, one is lost, I think." But dare I say it, I think Miller's missing the point a little here. This is precisely what distinguishes the Surrealists and Carroll from other creative writers and artists, and perhaps what distinguishes the pure from the applied mathematician and makes their work all the more remarkable. It is a determination not to stop at the point at which the work becomes unintelligible, but to push on and find the right context for it. But that's Miller for you.
I'm just a nut like all the others.
So in drawing to a close, let's bring all these disparate ideas together, and that needs some kind of a chart. You might be thinking a blank one, like the Bellman's chart from The Hunting of the Snark, or even a Lewis Carroll triliteral diagram. But no, we need something else.
And now a Venn diagram. Yes, diagrams, overlapping circles, Venn diagrams. Unique among Venn diagrams, this Venn diagram explains what a Venn diagram is. If you don't understand what a Venn diagram is, this won't help you.
So what I've tried to demonstrate here is that in mathematics, surrealism, and the mind of Lewis Carroll, there are underlying and connected threads. If we were to represent them on a Venn diagram, we might ask ourselves what would be in the center. If one wanted to put a single work in there by Carroll, it might be Through the Looking Glass, or even What the Tortoise Said to Achilles. But really, I think that central Roylo of the diagram should contain not a specific work, but a way of thinking. That is, an openness to embracing nonsense and a recognition of the significance of such concepts as reflection, recursion, and self-reference. And there we are. If you're still with me and have not drifted off into some hypnagogic wonderland, I thank you for at least embracing this load of old nonsense, if not rationalizing it.
What was that? That was very strange. It was very weird. Peculiar. It was kind of amusing. Yes, it was rather funny. It was incredibly funny. I loved it. Hilarious. More.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Mark. I believe we are all indeed still with you, and happily so. If we could get the spotlight on our last few speakers, and we'll get the Q&A going. So while we're getting that in shape, maybe we'll start with a question for Mark. You sort of close with that idea of what should be in the center of your diagram, and I wonder if you could speak a little more about how the idea of accepting nonsense and maybe pushing beyond incomprehensibility, how that applies more specifically in the mathematical realm. I think maybe it's more clear, at least to an amateur like myself, how it might apply to the sort of surrealism or the creative realm. But how does that fit into the mathematical worldview?
Well, I think the example which I gave, that I spoke about it very briefly, the square root of -1, for example. We know -1 can't have a square root because by definition it's a number which multiplied by itself gives us that number, and there can't be two numbers which multiplied by themselves give us a negative number. So why do we I'm not a mathematician, I studied mathematics, but why do mathematicians simply not say, well, that's nonsense, you can't have the square root of -1? but they don't. They study it. And then remarkably, you find that by studying the square root of -1, it opens up this massive branch of mathematics. And it really is fascinating, because there are problems in the real world, genuine mathematical problems that have applications in the real world that are very difficult to solve using traditional methods. But if you use these complex imaginary numbers, as they're called, you can solve the problem very, very quickly and easily. And then your answer is returned back in the real world. It's almost like stepping out into another dimension and then coming back, you know, like going through a wall. Instead of going through the door, you slip off into another dimension and come back. Well, if you took a real approach to mathematics and ignored anything that was nonsense, we would never have that branch of mathematics. And there are many others. I did very, very briefly talk about alternative geometries, non-Euclidean geometries, which we talk about. But I wouldn't say Einstein, would never call Einstein a mathematician. He had a different mindset. But without that willingness to embrace something that makes no sense in our real world, we wouldn't have all the great things that Einstein worked on, or those other mathematicians or applied physicists coming up with, you know, eventually quantum theory. So I guess my point really is that I don't know, maybe it's something in the way we would like the world to be simple, but we seem to have this idea that mathematics is all serious logical stuff and surrealism is all crazy nonsense stuff. And I guess what I'm trying to point out is that it's the same thing. They're just people looking at things with the same mindset. They just have different objectives, or using different tool set perhaps, but the mindset of being able to look at something that is nonsensical and try to find the meaning in it, or try to contextualize it so that it has meaning. That's really what I guess I was trying to do there.
And we also have a question from Eric. If he would ask if you would share your views on Wittgenstein.
No, because I don't know enough about Wittgenstein to be able to say anything that is intelligible. Well, gosh, we could have a whole day on Wittgenstein, couldn't we? Yeah, I guess if I had had a slightly better education, I might be able to have worked Wittgenstein into my talk. But I have to leave that to others, I'm afraid.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I'd like to go back to Caroline and Edward. There was this fascinating period where you mentioned the tragedy of there was a period, I believe in 1889, where only 64 people remained on the island. And then it was about 16 years before another priest was installed there. And I wonder if you could elaborate more on what is known about that period where there are only 64 souls on that island.
Would you like to answer that, Edward? As far as I know,
I was thinking, I was hoping that you would answer it, but
I think they struggled on, didn't they? And gradually, I think, you know, people started deciding that they would definitely stay there, and perhaps a few more people joined them, and families, you know, enlarged again. But I think it was probably quite a struggle for quite a number of years. I can't remember exactly when it was that there were more than, say, 150 people on the island, but I would think it was probably until at least about the 1930s or something. You know, until then they were literally just, you know, growing the numbers very slowly.
I would concur with that.
And then Caroline, I wonder if you could also say a little more about sort of the ongoing, I know you mentioned that after the eruption of the volcanoes that your family was very much involved with trying to help folks out who were impacted by that. I wonder if you could talk a little more about how that relationship has continued through the current times.
Well, sadly, I mean, I am a member on Facebook and watch it, you know, very interestedly. But I think that now they're in a whole new different situation, and they do have a very vibrant community. And, you know, they've got this fishing canning business there, which I think the Americans put in. And, you know, it seems to be going very well for them. So we were there. My grandmother was very keen that we should help out when the islanders came back to this country. But in fact, when we started investigating and everything, I think the social services and the people who were doing such a good job of keeping everybody together, and I think they wanted to stay together as a community rather than, my grandmother had ideas of all of us as families, you know, bringing people into our homes and letting them stay with us for a year or so. But of course, in the long run, it was much, much better to keep everybody together and to give them that safety of them all being together.
We have a question in the chat. In your book, you present a letter from Edwin to his family from Zanzibar, where he's requesting 4 musical boxes, the type with a handle which was cranked to use to entertain sick children. And the question is, have any of those music boxes remained in the family?
There are a few, I think, Caroline.
My cousin still has one, yes, which is a beautiful one. And there is one other that I can't remember who's got that, and it's sadly not in a good condition.
Your cousin has 2, I think. There's the big one and there's a very small one. The small one is not working.
Yeah, doesn't work. No, but they were lovely. I loved the big one. It's beautiful. Yeah.
I see that someone has asked if there's a proper pub on Tristan, and then somebody else has already answered that question by looking it up on Google Maps, and apparently there is.
Yeah,
I think
sure there is.
With self-isolating, it's not working.
And then sort of going back to Mark, this question is there any sense in which, well, I guess for everyone, is there any sense in which Edwin or Charles reflect each other? Is there some family reflection going on there? So I think that's a good one for everyone.
Go ahead, Edward.
Okay, I'll answer that one. There is a great deal of similarities between the two. I did mention the mathematics. The religion, I think, is more focused to his father than his brother. He was a ritualist, and that's the last thing that Dodson would have been. He was very much against that. But his father was very much a high churchman. Probably didn't go as far as being a ritualist, but there is certainly a similarity in their religions. Did you want any more? I haven't got any more.
I was going to say, I think that my great-grandfather Skeffington was far more like Charles in his thinking, wasn't he? Yes. And Edwin was more like his father. But of course, exactly we're all waiting for Charlie's book to come out, and the formed with faith. Yes.
And Mark, did you want to comment as well?
No, sorry to say no again to our question, but no, I think yeah, it's very hard to tell, isn't it? Because when normally when you look at a family, you know one member of the family, you tend to look at the others, what's that, compare and contrast. But I think there is a similarity between all the Dodsons, and I suspect it carries on even to generations now, of this combination of reverence and playfulness. I think it's a remarkable combination that sits behind everything they did. And I think you do see it in Skeffington. Some of the letters that Skeffington's written have got a Lewis Carroll type of humor in them. That's all I'd say. There is a question I will answer there, though, if I could. It says, did Lewis Carroll's thoughts on self-reflection have any effect on how he managed his own 2 identities? But I would like to answer that one because, and I'm sorry to disagree with the question, with the central premise of the question, but I don't think Lewis Carroll had two separate personalities. I don't think there is a Lewis Carroll and a Charles Dodson. And this comes up over and over again. It's something that people like to pick up on. Many biographers have made a big deal of it. But my view is that that thing that we might define as Carrollian or Carrollian humor is everywhere in Carroll's life. And I think that's the remarkable thing, that he was at the one point this very respectful, reverent man, and at the same time he had this nonsensical, shall we say, sense of humor. And you notice it, for example, the pamphlets of Lewis Carroll, the series of books published by Lewis Carroll Society of North America. The first one of that was edited by Edward Wakeling, and these are Oxford pamphlets. So this is Charles Dodson, the serious Oxford man, playing his role within the university and within the college, doing what he believed was the responsible thing. And his response to a lot of things going on was to publish a satirical pamphlet full of what we would call Carrollian humor. So similarly, if you look at some of the reminiscences of people who knew him in Christchurch, they said he was a raconteur. People say he was a fun person, more so I think when he was younger, but he was a fun person to be around. And another example would be the book called Euclid and His Modern Rivals, which is a serious, very scholarly book about the teaching of Euclid's geometry, which was being discussed quite a lot in the mid-Victorian era. And Carroll writes this, or Dodson writes this serious mathematical work, but he writes it in the form of a play, not a stage play to be acted, but a play to be read. And it's full of silly puns and jokes, and yet this is Charles Dodson, the serious mathematician, writing it. So yeah, it would be quite nice if we could say it'd be it's like a sort of romantic view of him as he's this serious, dry mathematician, and then suddenly something happens and he's the crazy Mad Hatter guy. But I don't think that's how it is at all. I think it's the same man throughout, and I think it's this remarkable combination of the serious and the reverent, together with the humorous nonsensical side, really. There's another question, because I wanted to say that.
There's another similar question about identity related. Is that in your view, was Carroll an author or a scholar first? Oh gosh,
I would. Well, is that a question where it has to be either or can we have like it's yes and no, or
he has to be
both. He was
definitely
a scholar and an educator first. I think that's true. An educator first. Edward, go on.
Yes, I think he's both. As a lecturer, he would obviously be an educator, but then he learnt things which were new to himself, which he probably got through books, and in that he would have been a scholar. So he's both, almost certainly.
But that desire to write was certainly there. I don't think there was a desire to write a bestseller. He wasn't aiming on carving out a career as an author for whatever reason. I think maybe that wouldn't have fitted quite well with his religious faith, but he certainly had that desire to write, because that happens very early on in the little childhood magazines, and it's right there to the end of his life. He's absolutely working flat out on trying to get this logic work done, but he's still publishing other little things for the pleasure. So it's a difficult one.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one or two more. So there's a question for Caroline. You mentioned that your grandmother told stories of when Uncle Charles would come to visit. Do you have a favorite story that you'd like to share?
Well, I think one of the ones was that she carried on with us as well as children, and that was that he suggested that he walked with her to the local little shop, and then he said, please, will you buy, here's some money, I want you to choose a present for your mother. And so she said she bought something which she thought afterwards was probably very distasteful, but it was a little jug with roses on it or whatever. And and they took that back. And it was a lesson that she then carried on with when I was a child, that she would send me with my aunt with some money to the shops and say, I want you to buy each of the family a present with this amount of money, and you must, you must budget it so that everybody gets a nice present. And if there's any money left at the end, then you're allowed to buy yourself a present. But also there was another lovely thing where I think she saw a little bee, a little silver bee in a shop once, and she thought, oh, I think Uncle Charles would love that. So they bought it and they sent it to him. And he then replied in a lovely little poem, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but with a little silver pig, which I still have. And it had a little curly tail on the end. And you pulled it out and there was a tape measure. And it said something about, so this little pig is much more clever. You can measure with it, but it also can grunt. So there were these lovely little bits of whimsy, really, which, they appreciated. And she loved going and visiting him at Christchurch as well, where he had a lovely desk with toys and everything in it. And she said she always remembered, I think there was a bear that she wound up with clockwork and it went roaring across the room.
All right, thank you. And I think we have one more question for Mark, which I think will be our final question. And our questioner is asking, can you change the sides of the triangle or the circles of the Venn diagram to read mathematics, surrealism, and religion, and then place Carroll himself found in the overlapping center?
Yeah, I saw that. I thought, I hope that one just slips by without me notice. It's a brilliant idea. It's a brilliant idea. I come with that yarn. Yeah, it's a good idea. Very good. I like it. I'm not sure I could off the cuff back it up with evidence, but I think that's a good thing. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, like it. Yeah. Can I just say that there's a bit of an irony for me, this really, because when I started looking at this, I thought, why am I using a Venn diagram to talk about Lewis Carroll? Why aren't I using one of Lewis Carroll's triliteral diagrams? Because as soon as I try and plot this idea on a Lewis Carroll diagram, it has absolutely no meaning at all. It's a mess. I mean, I love Carroll's logic diagrams, but the Venn diagram draws out those relationships. Yeah, they're better. But I'll look into that thing that Jan has said, because I like it. Yeah, this is perhaps more Charlie Lovett's area than mine, but it's a good idea. Yeah.